Part of the reason people have a hard time understanding evolution is it's really slow. Most of it we can't observe in our lifetime. So, one of the most important things to understand is microevolution, because this type we can see. Microevolution is an important concept to understand because it's something we can observe within our lifetimes, and that's not true for most of evolution. Microevolution is exactly what it sounds like. It is small evolution. Here we're talking about small, noticeable changes within a population between different generations. So all you need to do is have at least two different generations of a species to compare. Here's an example where we're looking at a beetle population and we're noticing that the color of beetles or the average color of beetles changes from one generation to the next. But let's look at a maybe more an exciting example. Let's go back to the Galapagos and talk about some of our finches. So Peter and Rosemary Grant in the 1970s, they decided they wanted to go back to the Galapagos and see what Darwin saw. And I get that. I want to do that too. Specifically, they went to the island of Daphne Major and they were talking about medium ground finches, these adorable little borbs here. But let's look at what they did. So every summer they would go and they would take several different measurements. One of the measurements they took was beak depth, or basically how tall their beak is. That's basically a proxy for how strong. Larger beaks were a little bit stronger because they had more force behind them, so they could open harder nuts and seeds. So here we're looking at graphs for two different years. You might notice the blue one is a lot smaller than the red one. So, which one do you think has more individuals in their population? Think back to calculus, area under the curve. You can see that the blue population has a lot more individuals. And 2 years later, in 1978, in our little red bell curve here, there's a lot fewer animals in our population. One of the things that happened in between these 2 years was a drought. And of course, with a drought, there's a lot less food available, and unfortunately, a lot of the birds ended up dying. You can see the population is still there, but it's a lot smaller, and there's been a noticeable change. Now, look at the mean or the average value for beak depth between these 2 years. You'll notice that there was a shift, a slight increase in the average beak depth. So after this drought, there are more birds with a slightly larger beak. This is because during the drought, there was less food, and very quickly, all of the easy to eat food was gobbled up. And after that, there was only these larger and more difficult to open nuts and seeds, and only the birds with a larger beak were able to survive. So, in just 2 years, we were able to see a fairly noticeable shift in the population level averages. Of course, it was also accompanied by a drastic reduction in population, but this is how natural selection acts many times. Natural selection tends to be a negative force of evolution. It is removing individuals that are not able to survive in those environmental conditions. I highly recommend you read this article from Scientific American by Peter Grant that talks more in depth about this example. But there's more than just these finches we can talk about. Let's talk about some peppered moths in London. So peppered moths, they have two different morphs or forms. They have a dark morph and a light morph. They're pictured here on a light tree and a dark tree. So you can see on the light tree, the light one is in that red circle there. It's really hard to see without that circle, but the dark one is very obvious to our eyes. Now, if we're looking at the dark tree, the opposite is true. The dark one blends in really well, but the light one pops right out. So we can see based on the environment, one has more advantage than the other. But it, of course, really depends on that environment. One thing that happened in London was the Industrial Revolution. Before the Industrial Revolution, pretty much all the trees in the area had lichen. So they were like this light tree on our left here. But the Industrial Revolution increased air pollution. It killed off all the lichen and darkened all the trees. So it is interesting how quickly humans can affect these environments. And with that, we actually saw a noticeable change in the relative numbers of the light and dark morphs in our London moths. Moths. So due to the increase in smog pollution, we had an increase in the dark moths. You see that green line, it's going up, and a decrease in the light moths, that line going down. So this is another example of microevolution. Since then, London has cleaned up its air, so we've seen a reversal of this trend, but we can see small changes like this present in many different populations. I highly encourage you to read this article by Lewinton on adaptation, also from Scientific American, as a great way to better understand this example. When we're talking about these instances of microevolution, there's a couple different ways selection could happen. One of the most easy to understand ones is called directional selection. So we're seeing this bell curve, it's moving in a direction. So with our finches, we saw the beaks got larger. In this beetle example, our beetles are getting darker. The most common example we'll see, though, is actually stabilizing selection, that it's actually just making it stay at the same value, and it's reducing extreme values on the low or the high ends. This is the most common because the population has probably already reached the optimal value for whatever is going on, and it's only when the environment changes are you going to see any directional selection like the previous one. The least common example, but we do sometimes see, is disruptive selection, where selection is actually selecting for the extremes on either end, but against that average in the middle. This is generally when speciation is happening, where we're seeing one population form into two, but overall, this is fairly rare. Another example we can see of microevolution is antibiotic resistance. This is interesting to understand how natural selection can make things a little bit more difficult for us. But let's go through this example. So first, we just have a population of bacteria. There's a variety of traits, and by chance, one of them actually might already be resistant. So if you have a normal population of bacteria, you treat them with antibiotics, most of them will die. But it's the ones that survive that you have to watch out for, because now you've just killed off most of them, and now there's a wide world for the ones who are already resistant to multiply, and now the entire strain can very easily become antibiotic resistant. So if you've ever bought soap or hand sanitizer that says it kills 99.9% of germs, oh my God, this is so good. It's that 0.1% that you need to watch out for. So the inappropriate use of antibiotics could actually encourage the evolution of more antibiotic-resistant strains. So make sure that you always use antibiotics as prescribed by your doctor. So, can you explain what's microevolution and what's an example?